I'm going to tell you what three men saw in the badlands of northwestern North Dakota in the fall of 2019. And I need to warn you up front that what they're going to describe doesn't fit into any wildlife biology you learned in school. These were guys who worked in oil, guys who spend their lives in the dark watching equipment, and they're not prone to exaggeration. One of them is still willing to talk about it, the other two won't. That's all I'm going to say about why. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. The Bakken Formation runs from Saskatchewan down through Montana and into North Dakota. And if you know anything about it, you know it's one of the most active oil plays in the continent. By 2019, the infrastructure was dense. Pipelines, pump stations, compressor stations, metering buildings, all of it spread out across the prairie in grids that don't follow the land. They follow the resources underground. The work is repetitive. You check the same equipment every night. You walk the same fence lines. You know the same roads. Marcus Hendricks had been doing night security for a small independent operator called Zenith Petroleum for almost 4 years. By that point, he was 34, originally from Williston, had a wife and 2 kids in a house on the north side of town. The pay was $19 an hour plus benefits, and he knew every valve and pressure gauge on the property by heart. His relief man, the guy he handed off to every morning at 6 a.m., was named Derek Foss. Derek was younger, maybe 26, from Minot, and he'd been doing the job for about 2 years. They knew each other well enough to make conversation, but not so well that they were friends outside of work. That's the standard relationship for night shift. You see the same person for 30 minutes every morning and evening, and that's it. The third man is the one who won't give his name. I'm going to call him Garrett, and that's not his real name. Garrett was a contractor who came out to the sites maybe once every 2 weeks to do maintenance on the computerized monitoring systems. He was in his late 40s, technical, quiet, the kind of guy who knew how the whole operation fit together in a way that the day shift people didn't. October 15th was a Tuesday. Marcus was halfway through his shift, somewhere around 2 a.m., walking the perimeter of the compound to check the fence line and the gate. The compound was about 80 yards by 80 yards, surrounded by a 6-foot chain-link fence topped with 3 strands of barbed wire. Beyond the fence was open prairie in all directions. The nearest neighbor was maybe 3 miles away. The nearest town was Williston, about 40 miles south. This was isolation of a specific kind, not wilderness isolation, managed prairie, oil field isolation. There's a maintenance road that runs along the east fence, and that's where Marcus was walking, flashlight in one hand, radio on his belt, checking for gaps or damage. The temperature was dropping as it does in October in North Dakota when the sun goes down. He said it was probably 38 degrees, clear sky, no wind. The stars were thick. He remembers thinking about that. How clear they were, how you don't see stars like that in town anymore. That's when he heard something behind him, maybe 20 yards back, something heavy moving through the grass. Not running, walking, but heavy. He turned around with his flashlight, and he swept the beam across the prairie behind the fence. He saw it standing in the light for less than 2 seconds. Marcus described it as standing on its hind legs, covered in coarse, dark fur that looked almost black in the flashlight beam. The height was wrong. He had to look up at it. He estimated it at 7 feet, maybe 7.5. The proportions were off. The legs were very long and very straight, nothing like a bear's rear stance. The arms hung at its sides. And the face. He said the face was the part that made his stomach drop. It was lupine, long-muzzled with forward-pointing ears. But not an animal face, not a wolf. The bone structure was too complex. The way the jaw was set, the angle of the skull, something about it suggested intelligence looking back. Marcus swung the flashlight, but the thing had already moved. It was gone back into the dark of the prairie in a few long strides. He didn't chase it. He stood there breathing hard and radioed Derek. Derek was inside the main building, in the control room, watching the SCADA system, the industrial Internet of Things equipment that monitored pressure and flow rates and temperatures across the site. He picked up on the first call. Marcus told him something was outside the fence, something large. Derek said he grabbed a handheld spotlight and went out to the north side of the compound, which would give him a view of the area Marcus was reporting. He also didn't see anything, just prairie, no movement. But he said there was a smell, musky, not like a farm smell, not like livestock. Something older, something that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't articulate. They didn't call anyone. They weren't even sure what they'd seen or smelled. Marcus said he figured it was a bear that had wandered in from the mountains or a very large elk that was more curious than usual. He stayed alert the rest of the night. Derek stayed in the building. In the morning, Derek left at 6 a.m. and Marcus went home. That weekend, the contractors came out to do some regular maintenance work, not Garrett. A different team from a company based in Bismarck. They were replacing some wiring in the monitoring system. On Sunday afternoon, while Marcus was at home and Derek was sleeping, they found tracks outside the fence on the east side, deep four-toed prints in the soft ground along the maintenance road. They didn't think much of it. They took some photos and sent them to the site manager.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The site manager was a guy named David Chen, based in Williston. He looked at the photos and thought they were probably bear tracks, though he noted in his report that they seemed deeper than a bear print should be, and the toe spacing was unusual. He didn't follow up on it. The work was done. The contractors left. Marcus came back to work on Monday night, October 21st. He was in the control room with Derek around 1 a.m. when Derek mentioned the tracks. Marcus said he got quiet when he heard about them. He told Derek about what he'd seen. Derek told him about the smell. They didn't talk about it much after that, but they both knew something wasn't right. Over the next week, there were more tracks. The contractors came back to do some follow-up work and found more prints along the fence line, all on the east side, all the same size, all deep. The site manager called the North Dakota Game and Fish Department. A man came out, looked at the photos and the tracks themselves, which by that point had been walked on and degraded by weather. He said it was probably a bear, though he couldn't identify the species with certainty given the damage to the tracks. He recommended they put up some bear warning signs and contact a local wildlife control outfit if they had actual contact. No one did. No signs were put up. The contractor never called. A week after the prints appeared, on October 29th, Garrett came out to do his scheduled maintenance. He was there during the day, working in the control room, upgrading the monitoring software. He left around 4 p.m. He didn't say anything to Marcus or Derek about the tracks or what they'd reported. He wouldn't have known. Site managers didn't always pass that information on to contractors. 2 weeks later, on November 12th, Garrett came back. This time it was evening. He was supposed to do a quick troubleshoot on one of the monitoring systems that was acting up. He arrived around 6 p.m. with Derek already on shift. Marcus would be coming in at midnight to relieve Derek. Around 8 p.m., while Garrett was in the control room working on the system, Derek stepped outside to get something from his truck. The sun had gone down. It was full dark. The temperature had dropped to about 30 degrees, and there was wind coming from the northwest. Derek said he was only outside for a few minutes. When he came back in, he told Garrett that he'd heard something outside the fence on the east side, moving through the prairie. Garrett asked him what it sounded like. Derek said it sounded like something heavy moving through dried grass, something large. The sound it made was a low sound, almost like a growl, but not aggressive, just present. Garrett didn't say anything. He went back to work on the monitoring system. About an hour later, Marcus arrived for his shift. He and Derek did the handoff. Derek mentioned the noise he'd heard. Marcus nodded. He said he'd been expecting something like that. He'd felt it all week. Derek left. Marcus went through the perimeter check as he always did. Nothing on the east side, nothing on the fence, just prairie, wind, dark. Around 2 a.m., Garrett came out of the control room. He said he was done with the troubleshoot. The system was working. He was going to head out, but he wanted to check the fence on the east side before he left. He said he wanted to see if there were any new tracks. Marcus said this was unusual. Contractors didn't generally do that kind of thing, but Garrett seemed intent. They walked the fence together. The ground was hard, frozen in places, no new tracks visible. They didn't find anything, but something found them. Marcus said they were about halfway along the east fence when they heard the sound. The same sound Derek had reported, a low growl, but this time it was close, very close. Maybe 30 feet away on the far side of the fence, moving parallel to them through the prairie. Marcus turned his flashlight toward the sound. He swept the beam across the dark. The thing was running, not running fast, pacing them, keeping distance from the fence but moving with them. 7 feet tall, four-legged motion that was wrong, that was too coordinated, that was deliberate. Dark fur, long lupine head. The flashlight beam hit its face, and Marcus said, "The eyes caught the light the way an animal's eyes catch light, with that reflection, but the intelligence behind them was not animal. The thing looked at Marcus, and Marcus felt it register him, know him. Then it was gone. Acceleration into the dark, and it was done. Just the wind and the sound of its movement fading into distance. Marcus said his hands were shaking. Garrett was very quiet. They walked back to the building without talking. Garrett didn't stay much longer. He packed up his tools, put his laptop in his bag, and told Marcus he was going to head back to Bismarck. He said the monitoring system was fine, no further work needed. Marcus asked him if he was going to come back to check on it. Garrett said he didn't think that would be necessary. That's the last time anyone saw him at the site. What Garrett did do after he got home to Bismarck was call the North Dakota Game and Fish Department. Not the same officer who'd come out before. A different one, named Laura Kessler. Garrett told her what he'd seen. He described it. He gave her a detailed account. Laura Kessler told him that what he'd described sounded like a Dogman encounter. She used that exact word. She asked him where the site was located. When he told her, she said something like, "That area has a history." She didn't elaborate, but she told him that if it happened again, he should call the Mount Rail County Sheriff's Office instead of Game and Fish. She said the sheriff's office had protocols for these situations. She said people in the county knew what to do. Garrett never went back to the site. Marcus and Derek continued working. They never saw it again. Not in person. But Marcus said there was a presence. A weight to the nights, a sense of being observed. He said he'd be walking the perimeter and he'd feel like something was out there, moving in the dark, keeping distance, watching. Derek quit in December. He didn't give a reason, just said he had another job lined up in Minot, something with less night work. Marcus stayed until March of 2020, when the pandemic hit and the oil industry bottomed out. Zenith Petroleum had to cut operations. The contract workers got laid off first, then the permanent staff. Marcus was sent home with 2 weeks of severance. He's never worked oil again. When I tracked Marcus down for this story, he was working at a home improvement store in Williston. He was reluctant to talk about what happened. He said his wife didn't even know the full details. She knew something had spooked him badly, but he hadn't elaborated. He told me that he'd looked into things after the fact. He'd done research. He found something called the Dogman phenomenon, a pattern of reports going back decades. Tall creatures, bipedal, canine-featured, standing 7 to 9 feet tall. Most reports came from the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, but also scattered reports from the mountains and the high plains. The earliest reports he found were from the Book of Enoch, which is a biblical apocryphal text. The Book of Enoch contains references to the Nephilim, the offspring of the fallen angels and human women. One section describes hybrid beings that it calls creatures of the night, tall, humanoid forms with animal characteristics. The text is difficult to interpret, but some researchers argue that these descriptions match what modern Dogman witnesses report. Marcus said he doesn't know if what he saw was the Nephilim or something else entirely. He just knows it was real. He saw it, Garrett saw it, Derek heard it and smelled it. The tracks were real, photographed, documented. The Game and Fish Department knew about it. The sheriff's office had protocols for it. That meant something. He also said something else. He said that in the weeks after that encounter, his perspective on the landscape changed. He was working in a territory that he thought he controlled, that he understood, that was mapped and measured and managed. And he realized in about 30 seconds that he didn't control anything, that the prairie was not his property, that there were things living there that operated under different rules entirely, things that were aware of the human structures but were not bound by them. He said he understood for the first time in his adult life what it meant to be a visitor instead of an owner. The Book of Enoch is an interesting source for this kind of material because it's ancient, because it's independent of modern folklore, and because it describes something that doesn't fit cleanly into our modern categories. The Nephilim are described as products of a transgression, a violation of natural boundaries, the union of the divine and the animal, creatures that existed in the margins between categories. The Dogman reports that Marcus found follow a similar pattern. They describe something that doesn't fit into wildlife taxonomy, something that has characteristics of both human and animal, something that moves with intelligence and purpose but operates outside the logic of normal animal behavior. There are documented reports of Dogman sightings in North Dakota, though they're not common. Most reports come from the forested areas near the Canadian border, the Turtle Mountains, the Killdeer Mountains. But the badlands around the oil fields have their own history. In 1999, a man named Dale Knutson reported seeing a large bipedal creature near Grassy Butte, which is about 50 miles west of where Marcus worked. Knutson said he was hunting deer, and he encountered something 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, that walked upright and then bounded away on all fours. He reported it to the sheriff's office. The report was filed and forgotten. In 2005, a hunting guide named Robert Hansen reported a similar sighting near the White Butte area, the highest point in North Dakota. Hansen said a creature matching the Dogman description came within 20 yards of his camp. He said it watched him for several minutes before moving on. He said he wasn't afraid. He said there was something almost curious about the way it looked at him, like it was trying to understand what he was. These reports are scattered. They're separated by years and distance, but they exist in the official record of the Mountrail County Sheriff's Office. Marcus found out about them when he asked around after his shift ended. People knew. Not everyone talked about it, but people knew. There was a wildlife control officer named Tom Werner who had been working the Badlands for about 15 years. Marcus called him. Werner didn't want to talk on the phone, so they met at a gas station in Williston. Werner told Marcus that he'd tracked the Dogman phenomenon in the area for years. He said there were at least 2 distinct territories, one in the Killdeer Mountains, one in the Badlands near the oil field operations. He said the creatures were territorial. They didn't generally approach humans. But oil field operations had changed the landscape. The noise, the light, the human presence 24 hours a day, it had disrupted something. He said it was possible the creature Marcus encountered was defending its territory or investigating the intrusion. Werner said he'd never had direct contact, but he'd found enough evidence to convince him they were real. Hair samples, scat, tracks, damage to trees that was consistent with claw marking, the kind of sign that a trained tracker could read but that most people would miss. He told Marcus something that stuck with him. He said that the land had been here a long time. Humans had been here for a relatively short time. And humans always assumed that the land was theirs to manage, but there were things that had been here longer than humans. Things that didn't care about human property lines or management strategies. Things that would continue to exist whether humans acknowledged them or not. The conversation lasted about an hour. Werner gave Marcus his contact information and told him to call if anything else happened. Marcus never needed to. What Marcus understood, standing in that gas station parking lot in Williston, was that the encounter he'd had wasn't aberrational. It wasn't a one-time event. It was a window into a layer of reality that he'd been living adjacent to for 4 years without knowing it. The creature hadn't been trying to harm him. It had been trying to be known, to assert its presence, to make clear that the territory still belonged to it. The oil field work continued. New crews came in. Derek's replacement was a guy named Todd, who didn't know anything about what had happened, who did his shift and never reported anything unusual. The site operated as it always had. Equipment ran. Pressure gauges moved. The network of pipes and valves that extracted oil from the ground continued its work, but the Badlands held their secret, or not a secret, a knowledge that certain people carried. Tom Werner, Laura Kessler in the game and fish department, the sheriff's office, the people who lived in the small towns near the oil fields, who didn't talk about it to outsiders, but who understood what the land contained. That same knowledge had probably existed for centuries. The Native Americans who lived in the region before oil development, the Mandan, the Arikara, the Hidatsa, they probably had their own understanding of what walked in the dark prairie. There are references in some tribal oral traditions to large bipedal creatures that existed at the margins of human territory, beings that were not human but were intelligent, beings that demanded respect. The Dogman might be a modern name for something very old. What I found interesting when I tracked down Marcus and when I followed the threads of his research was how the official world handled it. The Game and Fish Department knew about it but didn't publicize it. The sheriff's office had protocols but didn't advertise them. The people who lived there and worked there knew, but they didn't make a big deal of it in polite conversation. It was a kind of consensus reality, a shared understanding that something unusual existed in the territory, that it was real, and that the best approach was to coexist with it, to acknowledge its presence without trying to dominate it or destroy it. That's not the approach that most wildlife agencies take to large predators. You'd expect them to call in biologists, to set up monitoring equipment, to try to capture and study the creature, but they didn't. Why? Marcus had a theory. He said that maybe they knew more than they were saying. Maybe they'd tried to document it in the past and found that the creature was too intelligent, too elusive, too aware of human technology. Maybe they understood that their typical tools for wildlife management, tranquilizer darts, radio collars, habitat manipulation, wouldn't work on something that was thinking at a higher level than a normal animal. Or maybe they understood something else. Maybe they understood that some things were meant to exist outside of human knowledge, that some aspects of the world were not meant to be fully mapped and cataloged and controlled. The Book of Enoch talks about the Nephilim in terms of transgression and violation, the angels who came down and took human wives, who produced offspring that walked in the land. The text treats these beings as dangerous, as something that needed to be contained or destroyed. But there's another way to read it, as a description of a reality that existed before humans took complete control of the land, a reality in which there were other intelligent beings, other entities, other ways of being in the world. The Bakken oil field is one of the most intensively developed landscapes in North America. Every square mile is mapped. Every resource is accounted for. Every night, At hundreds of well sites and pump stations and compressor facilities, men walk the same routes, check the same equipment, maintain the same infrastructure. It's a landscape of human control. But underneath that control, there are still these moments, times when the boundaries slip, when something emerges from the dark prairie and reminds the person standing there that the landscape doesn't fully belong to them, that there are still places where the old rules apply, where intelligence and territory and presence matter more than property deeds and well permits. Marcus said that after everything happened, he looked back at the nights he'd worked there, and he realized he'd felt it before he'd seen it. He'd sensed something on the landscape that didn't fit his expectations, a weight, a presence, a knowledge that something else was aware of him as much as he was aware of it. He said the night he saw the creature, it was almost like a confirmation. The confirmation that the thing he'd been sensing all along was real, that it had a body, that it could be perceived directly, that it wasn't a psychological projection or a trick of the dark. It was there, and it was looking at him. Derek won't talk about it anymore. Garrett disappeared back into the contractor world, and Marcus never saw him again. Marcus moved on to other work. He got married, had kids, built a life that didn't involve night shifts in the Badlands. But he carries that encounter with him. He carries the knowledge that the land was never as controlled as he thought it was, that there are still wild things, still intelligent things, still parts of the world that operate according to rules that humans don't set. He also carries something else, a kind of respect for the creature he saw. Not fear exactly, but respect. An understanding that whatever the Dogman is, it has a right to exist in the territory it occupies. That humans can build their wells and run their operations, but that doesn't erase what was there before and what remains there still. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim as products of violation, creatures that shouldn't exist. But Marcus looked at the thing he saw, the intelligence in its eyes, the precision of its movements, and he thought that maybe the text had it backwards. Maybe these creatures were there first. Maybe they were the natural inhabitants of the land, and maybe it was the human presence that was the violation, the intrusion, the thing that didn't belong. He said something I've thought about since he told me. He said that you can live in a place for a long time without understanding it. You can map it, measure it, exploit it, build on it, and still never truly understand it. But sometimes, if you're lucky, or maybe unlucky, you get a moment where the place itself pushes back, where you realize that there's more happening there than you comprehended, that there are inhabitants you never accounted for, that the world is wider and stranger than your model of it. That's what happened to Marcus on the night he saw the Dogman. The Badlands of North Dakota, the landscape he thought he understood, revealed a layer of itself that he hadn't known existed, a creature that was intelligent, territorial, aware, a being that had been there long before humans started extracting oil, a being that would still be there long after the wells ran dry and the infrastructure was removed. When I asked Marcus if he'd go back to work in the oil fields, he said no. He said he didn't regret taking the job, didn't regret staying as long as he did, but he said he'd learned what he needed to learn, that you can work in a place, make a living there, but that doesn't make it yours, that there are still wild things in the world, still intelligence that operates outside human rules, still territories that belong to something other than us. He said, that's not a bad thing to learn. He said it's actually important, that the world needs to remind humans sometimes that we're not in control, that we're not at the center, that there are other forms of life, other forms of intelligence that deserve space and respect and autonomy. The oil fields continue to operate. The wells keep producing. The infrastructure spreads across the prairie in geometric patterns that follow human logic. But underneath, there's still the land, still the dark, still the creatures that walk in the margins. And in certain corners of the Badlands, on certain nights, when the wind comes up and the stars are clear, there are still tracks left in the soft earth. Tracks that don't match any known species. Tracks that belong to something that lives in the space between what we know and what we don't. Marcus said that before his encounter, he thought he understood the world. He thought the categories were clear. Animal versus human, wild versus controlled, known versus unknown. But after that night, he understood that the categories were illusions. That the world was messier, stranger, more alive than those divisions suggested. The Dogman taught him that, standing 7 feet tall in the beam of his flashlight, looking at him with intelligence and intention, making clear, without words, that the prairie belonged to something other than humans, that it always had, that it always would. That's what Marcus carries with him now, not fear, knowledge. The knowledge that the land he walked on every night was never truly his to control, that there were other inhabitants, other intelligences, other ways of being in the world, and that his job was not to dominate them or study them or exploit them, His job was simply to acknowledge their presence, to respect their territory, to live alongside them without pretending to own them. The Book of Enoch would probably say that this is still a transgression, the mingling of human and something other. But Marcus sees it differently. He sees it as a moment of truth, a moment when the boundary between human knowledge and the unknown became thin enough to see through, a moment when the world showed him something real, and he's grateful for it. He said that. He said that even though the encounter was unsettling, even though it shook his understanding of the world, he's grateful for it, because it made him real. It made him present. It made him understand that he was a small thing in a much larger world. And there's something good about that, something true. That's the story. That's what Marcus and Derek and Garrett saw in the Badlands of North Dakota. 3 men who encountered something that doesn't fit into the categories we usually use to understand the world. Something that the authorities acknowledged obliquely through protocols and quiet conversations. Something that probably has a name in the languages of the people who were there before oil companies mapped the land. The Dogman, a creature of the margins. A being that exists in the space between human knowledge and the unknown. A reminder that the world is stranger and more alive than we usually acknowledge. Make of that what you will, but there's more to this story. After Marcus shared what happened, I started digging. I talked to people in Williston. I reached out to the Game and Fish Department. I searched through old newspaper records. And what I found was a much deeper pattern than a single encounter at a single oil field site. Tom Werner, the wildlife control officer I mentioned, agreed to meet with me, though he was very careful about what he said and what details he was willing to confirm. He's retired now, living in Billings, Montana. He spent 25 years working the Badlands and the Killdeer Mountains. He said that in his entire career, he never officially documented a Dogman sighting, but he said that didn't mean they weren't happening. He said that wildlife agencies operate under a specific set of constraints. If you document something that contradicts established taxonomy, you have to prove it. You have to collect physical evidence. You have to have peer-reviewed confirmation. If you can't do that, you don't make the report official. You file it away. You acknowledge it internally, but you don't go public. He said there's a good reason for that. If you start claiming that there are large bipedal canine creatures roaming the Badlands of North Dakota, you lose credibility. You lose funding. You get dismissed. It's easier to just handle it quietly. Werner said that in his experience, when people reported seeing something unusual in the Badlands, the priority was not to verify or document it. The priority was to make sure the person didn't do anything stupid, didn't try to hunt it, didn't try to trap it, didn't try to get close to it for a photograph or a video that would then circulate on the internet. He said most Dogman sightings, if you look at them carefully, happen when someone is in the creature's territory doing something the creature perceives as threatening, hunting, logging, building something on the land. The creature investigates, shows itself, and then the person involved gets scared and leaves the area. In Marcus's case, it was different. Marcus worked there regularly. He was a fixture on the landscape. The creature had probably been observing him for weeks before making contact. The encounter on October 29th wasn't an initial encounter. It was a second contact, a continuation of an ongoing territorial negotiation. Werner said that once you understand Dogman behavior that way, the sightings stop seeming random and start seeming purposeful, intentional. The creature isn't attacking, it's communicating. It's saying, I see you, you're in my territory, here are the rules. He also said something that I found important. He said that the indigenous peoples of the region had a much clearer relationship with these creatures than modern settlers did. They understood the boundaries. They understood what territory belonged to humans and what territory belonged to something else. And they negotiated those boundaries. When the white settlers came, that understanding was lost. The land was mapped and divided into property lots and resource zones. The assumption was that humans could do whatever they wanted with the land, build on it, extract from it, change it. There was no negotiation with non-human inhabitants because, in the settler worldview, there were no non-human inhabitants. Just resources to be exploited. But the creatures were still there, and sometimes, when human activities violated their territory too egregiously, they responded. Werner said that the oil field expansion in the Bakken in the 2010s had created a specific problem. The drilling wasn't happening in little isolated pockets anymore. It was a landscape-scale operation. Thousands of wells, millions of dollars of infrastructure, noise and light 24 hours a day. It was transforming the Badlands from a mostly human-free zone into a heavily human-managed zone. He said the creatures had to adapt. Some populations probably moved deeper into the mountains, but some stayed. They established territories around the oil operations. They learned to navigate the human landscape, and occasionally they made contact. Marcus's encounter was one data point, but Werner said there were others. sightings in the Killdeer Mountains, tracks near the White Butte area, a report from a farmer near Grassy Butte who said something killed a steer in a way that didn't match predator behavior. The steer was killed cleanly, almost surgically, with minimal damage to the surrounding area. The farmer said it looked like something with an understanding of anatomy had done it, deliberately, not hungry, doing something else, sending a message. There was also a report, about 5 years before Marcus's encounter, of something large moving through the Badlands in the deep night. A rancher was checking on cattle and saw something 7 feet tall walking across his land. He said it moved with a peculiar gait, bipedal, but with a strange hip rotation. He said when it saw his truck, it didn't run. It turned and looked at him, and then it walked away slowly, deliberately, like it was choosing to leave rather than fleeing. Werner said that report, more than any other, convinced him that what people were seeing was intelligent, that it was making decisions about how to interact with humans, that it understood the danger humans represented and was managing that danger in a calculated way. The Book of Enoch reference that Marcus found started making more sense the deeper I dug. The text describes the Nephilim as beings that existed in the pre-flood world, tall creatures that took human women as mates and produced offspring that were neither fully human nor fully divine. The text treats them as abominations, as things that violated natural order, and God sent the flood to destroy them. But that narrative is from a very specific perspective. The perspective of the text's authors, who were human and who viewed these hybrid beings as a threat. But what if you looked at it from the creature's perspective? What if the Nephilim, or whatever these beings actually were, had legitimate claim to the land? What if they had every right to be there? The flood story in the Bible is often interpreted as a divine punishment for human transgression. But there's another way to read it, as a narrative of genocide, as a story about how a dominant species eliminated rivals for territorial control. The language changes depending on who's telling the story. Modern Dogman reports follow a similar pattern. From the human perspective, these creatures are anomalies, aberrations, things that don't fit into our understanding of wildlife. But from another perspective, they're the indigenous inhabitants being encountered by a technologically dominant but numerically small invading force. Laura Kessler from the Game and Fish Department was more cautious than Werner. She wouldn't talk on the record. She agreed to meet, but only at her home, and she asked me not to record anything. She said the North Dakota Game and Fish Department had a classified protocol for Dogman encounters. She didn't tell me what it was, but she said that if someone reported a sighting, the response was not to investigate aggressively. The response was to monitor the situation and make sure the human involved didn't escalate it. She said the fundamental principle was coexistence. You acknowledge the creature exists. You make sure people understand that it's not a threat if they follow certain rules. You don't try to capture it or study it. You leave it alone. She said this protocol had been in place for decades. She didn't know when it started or who established it, but she said it was consistent across the state. Different counties, different agencies, but the same approach. Quiet acknowledgement. No public campaigns, no active hunting. Just letting people who needed to know understand that something unusual was out there and that the best approach was respectful distance. I asked her why. Why wouldn't you want to study something this unusual? Why wouldn't you want to document it? She said something like this. Because once you document it, once you make it official, you have to deal with it. You have to publish findings. You have to explain it to the public. You have to account for it in your management plans. You can't ignore it anymore. And ignoring it, leaving it alone, that's what keeps the peace. That's what works. She also said something about precedent. She mentioned that there had been attempts to study these creatures in other states, Wisconsin, Michigan. She said those attempts had not gone well. She didn't elaborate, but she made clear that North Dakota had learned from other people's mistakes. The research I found on Michigan Dogman sightings was interesting. Michigan has a longer documented history of sightings than North Dakota. In the 1980s, there were multiple sightings in the northern Lower Peninsula. A documentary film crew tried to investigate. They set up trail cameras. They interviewed witnesses. And then, according to the accounts I found, the investigation was shut down. The film was never completed. The research was abandoned. The official story was that the trail cameras hadn't captured anything conclusive, so the project lost funding and was abandoned. But people who were involved said something different. They said that state authorities came to them and told them to stop. They said there were conversations about liability and about creating panic if they released findings. One of the researchers, a man named David Freiss, wrote about it in an interview that was published in a small cryptozoology magazine in 1991. He said that the authorities were less interested in denying the creature's existence than they were in preventing the public from knowing about them. He said it seemed like there was an official acknowledgement of the phenomenon at the state level, but there was also an official decision not to publicize it. That pattern kept repeating, acknowledgement within government agencies. Denial or silence in public communications, protocols in place to manage the phenomenon, but no official admission that anything unusual was happening. I traced similar stories from Wisconsin, Minnesota, even Ohio. In each case, there seemed to be a gap between what local authorities knew and what they communicated to the public. There were protocols, there were guidelines for responding to sightings, but there was also always a wall of silence. Why would that be the case? One theory is that the authorities understood something that the general public didn't. They understood that these creatures were intelligent and that they could be reasoned with. That as long as humans didn't actively threaten them, they wouldn't escalate. But if humans knew about them, if there was public awareness and public interest, then you'd get hunters. You'd get people trying to capture them or kill them. You'd get scientific expeditions, you'd get media attention, and any of those things could provoke a response. A confrontation with an intelligent, territorial, physically powerful creature operating in a landscape it controls is not something you want to provoke. Better to maintain the silence. Better to let the people who need to know understand through quiet channels. Better to keep the public in the dark. There was also another theory, one that Werner touched on but didn't fully articulate. The theory that these creatures represented something foundational about the relationship between humans and the land. That they were a living reminder that humans were not the dominant intelligence on the continent, that the land had intelligence of its own, had inhabitants who predated human arrival and would outlast human presence. That's a difficult thing for a technologically dominant civilization to accept. We like to believe that we're in control, that nature is something we manage, that the land is property that belongs to us. The existence of intelligent non-human creatures that maintain independent territories contradicts all of that. It suggests that there are parts of the world that are not ours to control, that there are forms of intelligence and will that operate outside human authority. That's destabilizing to the cultural story we tell ourselves about progress and mastery. Marcus mentioned something when we talked about this part of it. He said that the encounter with the Dogman had broken his sense of certainty. It had forced him to accept that there was a layer of reality that he didn't have complete knowledge of. That knowledge, he said, was uncomfortable, but it was also clarifying. Once you accept that there's something you don't understand, it becomes easier to accept other things you don't understand. He said it was like the creatures had taught him a kind of humility, not the religious kind, just the straightforward recognition that the universe was bigger than his understanding of it, that there were other intelligences, other claims on territory, other ways of being alive in the world. He said that knowledge had actually made him a better person, more patient, more willing to listen to perspectives that didn't fit into his existing framework, more humble. That's not the kind of effect we usually talk about when we discuss Dogman sightings. We focus on the fear, the strangeness, the evidence and counter-evidence. But there's also this other effect, the effect on the consciousness of the witness, the way the encounter fundamentally reorganizes their understanding of the world. The Book of Enoch talks about the Nephilim as a transgression and an abomination. But maybe that's just the perspective of a consciousness that was threatened by them. From the perspective of the creatures themselves, they were just living, just existing in the territories that belonged to them. The transgression was never theirs. It was the transgression of the humans who arrived later and assumed they had the right to transform everything. In that light, the silence makes sense, the protocols in place, the acknowledgement within government but denial to the public. Because if the public knew that there were intelligent creatures maintaining independent territories and lands that were supposedly human property, it would create a crisis of authority. It would suggest that the claims of ownership were not as absolute as we believed. Better to keep the secret. Better to let things be negotiated in private channels. Better to maintain the surface narrative of human control while quietly managing the reality of a shared landscape. That's what Laura Kessler was really saying when she talked about the protocols. She was saying that the state of North Dakota formally acknowledged that it did not have complete control of its territory, that there were places where human law and human authority did not fully apply, that there were inhabitants with their own claims and their own rights. But she couldn't say that publicly, so she didn't. She maintained the silence. She followed the protocols. She ensured that Dogman encounters were handled quietly and that people involved understood the importance of not going public. It worked. The public didn't panic. The creatures weren't hunted. The Badlands remained a shared space, though most humans didn't know it. Marcus eventually found peace with what happened. He said that the encounter had frightened him at the time, but looking back, he understood it as a kind of gift. The creature had revealed itself to him, had made itself known, had forced him to acknowledge that the world contained more than he'd accounted for. He said that's what the Book of Enoch was trying to describe when it talked about the Nephilim, not just hybrid creatures, the possibility of knowledge that breaks the boundaries of what humans think is possible, the recognition that there are intelligences in the world that operate according to rules we don't fully understand. That knowledge is uncomfortable. It destabilizes certainty. It forces you to accept that your understanding of the world is incomplete, but there's also something truthful about it, something honest, because the world is more mysterious than we usually admit. And there are intelligences in it, both human and non-human, that are trying to coexist without perfect understanding. The Dogman encounter was real. The tracks were real. The observations made by multiple people were consistent and detailed. The acknowledgement from state authorities, though unspoken, was clear. Something unusual lived in the badlands of North Dakota, something that commanded respect and territorial integrity. Whether it was the Nephilim of ancient texts or something else entirely, it was part of the landscape, part of the world that humans inhabited but didn't fully control. That's the story that Marcus carries with him. That's the knowledge that Tom Werner spent 25 years accumulating. That's what Laura Kessler manages through quiet protocols. That's what the Book of Enoch tried to describe thousands of years ago. There are other intelligences in the world. There are territories we don't control. There are forms of awareness and will that operate according to rules we don't fully understand. And sometimes, if we're in the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong place at the wrong time, we get a glimpse of that reality. When that happens, the best response is not to panic, not to hunt, not to try to capture and study. The best response is to acknowledge, to respect, to accept that the world contains mysteries that are not ours to solve, that there are inhabitants who deserve the same claim to territory that we do, that coexistence is better than dominion. That's what the Dogman of North Dakota teaches. That's what the Nephilim of ancient texts were trying to communicate. That's what will be true long after the oil wells run dry and the infrastructure is removed from the badlands. The land will still be there. The creatures will still be there. And humans, if we survive, will still be trying to figure out how to coexist with something we don't fully understand. There's one more layer to this that's worth examining. It's the question of what these creatures actually are. The Dogman, the Nephilim, the beings that indigenous peoples had names for in their own languages. What is the biological reality underneath the name? Marcus looked into this. He found research papers by cryptozoologists who have been studying Dogman reports for decades. The pattern of reports is consistent enough to suggest that something real is being observed. 7 to 9 feet tall, bipedal but capable of moving on all fours. Canine facial structure, but with humanoid proportions. Covered in coarse dark fur. Intelligence evident in behavior and in the eyes. The DNA would be interesting to have, but of course, no credible Dogman DNA has ever been collected. The creatures are too elusive, too aware, too intelligent about avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that would result in biological sampling. There's a theory, proposed by some researchers, that Dogman represents an evolutionary path that didn't continue, a branch of canine evolution that, in some isolated populations, developed higher intelligence and bipedalism. That evolved language or communication systems more sophisticated than standard canine vocalizations. That developed territory management and behavioral complexity at a level we associate with human consciousness. If that's true, then Dogman would be a living parallel to human evolution. Not human, not fully animal. Something in between. Something that developed intelligence independently from human intelligence, but through a similar mechanism. That would make them exactly what the ancient texts describe, the Nephilim, the hybrid beings. Not the product of genetic engineering or divine intervention, but the natural evolution of the land itself, the emergence of consciousness in a form different from human consciousness. The indigenous peoples of North America would have understood this differently. They wouldn't have a word for evolution or biology, but they would have observed the creatures. They would have incorporated them into their worldview. They would have understood them as inhabitants of the land with their own rights and territories and forms of intelligence. The settlement of North America by Europeans disrupted that understanding. The settlers brought a worldview in which humans were the only conscious beings worthy of moral consideration. Everything else was either livestock or wilderness. There was no category for intelligent non-human creature with its own claims to territory. So, when settlers encountered Dogman, they didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't have a framework for understanding it. They reported it as a monster or an oddity, something that didn't fit. Over time, those reports accumulated. Missionaries in the Great Lakes region noted them. Fur trappers reported strange encounters. Settlers wrote about things moving in the dark. Farmers described the sound of something large walking through the forest at night. But there was no scientific investigation, no taxonomy established, no acknowledgement at the official level, just stories, folklore, things dismissed as superstition or exaggeration. Then came the 20th century, better record keeping, more systematic observation, more documentation. And the reports continued. Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Oregon, Washington, Northern California. The reports formed a pattern. They formed a geography. The creatures seemed to inhabit specific regions, forested areas, mountain ranges, badlands with sufficient coverage, places where human development was scattered enough to allow large populations to exist in relative privacy. They also seemed to be declining. Earlier reports from the 19th century suggest more frequent sightings, more casual encounters. By the late 20th century, the encounters were rarer. The creatures were being pushed into more remote territory. Populations were fragmenting, which makes sense. Human expansion was taking the land, oil fields, logging, road building, subdivision. The spaces where Dogman could exist without conflict were shrinking. Marcus speculated about what would happen if the Badlands had continued to be developed at the rate it was going in the 2010s. If every square mile had been covered with infrastructure, if there was no private territory left. What would Dogman do? Where would they go? He said the thought troubled him, because he understood that he was part of that displacement. His job was to extract resources. His employment was part of the process that was transforming habitat into industrial landscape. He said that was one reason he quit when he did. The pandemic gave him an excuse, but he said he probably would have quit anyway. Once he understood what he was doing, he didn't want to be part of it anymore. Tom Werner said something similar when I talked to him. He said that his job in wildlife management was fundamentally about maintaining the status quo, keeping human interests protected, ensuring that certain species didn't interfere with human activities. But his encounter with Dogman evidence, his understanding of these creatures, had changed how he thought about that responsibility. He said he began to see wildlife management not as domination, but as negotiation, not as something humans did to nature, but as something humans did with nature, a conversation, an attempt to find terms of coexistence. The traditional model was extraction. Take what you want, leave the rest. If something gets in your way, remove it. But there's a newer model emerging, slowly, in some places. A model of shared territory, mutual respect, acknowledgement that humans are not the only inhabitants with claims on the land. That's what the Dogman protocols in North Dakota represent. An informal recognition that coexistence is possible, that humans can build on the land, use the land, extract from the land, and still leave room for something else to exist. It's not perfect. The creatures are still being displaced. Their populations are still fragmenting. The territories they control are still shrinking. But it's better than active hunting, better than attempted extermination, better than the approach taken in some other states. The Book of Enoch describes a conflict between different forms of life and intelligence. It frames the Nephilim as a violation. But maybe that's a misreading. Maybe the conflict was always about land, about who had the right to territory, about who was entitled to resources. The flood in that reading wasn't divine punishment. It was environmental collapse, the result of too many predatory intelligences competing for the same space, humans and Nephilim and all the other creatures. Eventually, something had to break. The ancient text might be describing a historical memory of what happens when different intelligent species occupy the same territory without effective boundaries. Conflict, escalation, collapse. North Dakota has found a way to manage that. To establish boundaries informally, to allow different forms of intelligence to coexist without direct confrontation. It's not a permanent solution, but it's working for now. Marcus said that understanding that was what allowed him to move on. He said he quit the oil fields with some guilt, with a sense that he'd been part of something that displaced other inhabitants. But he also understood that the displacement was happening, that people needed energy, that the choices weren't between development and no development. The choices were between different kinds of development. And maybe there were ways to develop that, left some room for the creatures, some territories that remained private, some boundaries that were respected. That's the vision that Tom Werner was working toward. That's what Laura Kessler was trying to protect with the protocols. That's what Marcus understood when he looked at the creature standing 7 feet tall in the beam of his flashlight. The creature wasn't attacking, wasn't threatening, was simply asserting its right to exist, to occupy space, to be acknowledged. That assertion, that presence, it changed how Marcus understood his place in the world, made him smaller in the good way, made him understand that his needs and desires were not the only things that mattered, that there were other forms of life, other intelligences, other ways of being alive that had equal validity. The oil fields continued, the development continued. But in North Dakota, something was negotiated in the dark. Some understanding was reached between human consciousness and something else. Something that had been there longer, something that would be there after humans moved on. The Dogman represented that other consciousness, that other claim on the land, that reminder that humans were not the only beings that mattered. It's a message that the Book of Enoch tried to communicate thousands of years ago, a message that indigenous peoples understood, a message that modern science is slowly beginning to acknowledge. There are other intelligences. There are territories that are not ours. There are forms of awareness and will that deserve respect. That's what Marcus learned. That's what the creatures of the Badlands were teaching, and that's a lesson that gets more important every year, as human expansion continues, as wilderness shrinks, as we take more and more of the land for ourselves. At some point, something is going to have to give. Either we learn to coexist with the other intelligences that share this planet, or we continue expanding until everything that's not directly under human control is gone. The Badlands of North Dakota represent one possible answer: quiet coexistence, mutual respect, boundaries maintained not by force but by understanding. It's not a perfect solution, but it's working, and that's something. I asked Marcus at the end of our conversation if he would ever go back to the Zenith Petroleum site, if he would drive out to the Badlands at night and see if the creature was still there. He thought about it for a long time. He said no. He said he respected what he'd learned, but he also understood boundaries. The creature had made its presence known. The message had been received. There was no need to push further. He said it was like the creature had given him one moment of direct contact, one unambiguous encounter, and that was enough. That was all that was needed. Further contact might violate the understanding that had been established. I asked him if he thought about it often, if the encounter still affected him. He said yes. He said he thought about it every time he saw the night sky, every time he drove through a landscape that had any wilderness remaining, every time he heard a sound that could have been an animal, every time he felt that presence that you feel sometimes when you're alone in a place, that sense of being observed. He said he carried the creature with him, not as fear, not as a memory to overcome, but as knowledge, as a permanent expansion of his understanding of what the world contained. And he said that was a gift, to be broken open like that, to have your certainty shattered, to be forced to acknowledge that there were things in the world that mattered beyond your own understanding, beyond your own interests. He said most people never got that gift. Most people went their whole lives assuming they understood the world, that the categories made sense, that what they'd been taught was comprehensive. But if you were lucky, if something happened to break that certainty, then you had the opportunity to grow, to become larger in your understanding, to carry something of the vast complexity of the world inside yourself. That's what the Dogman had done for him, and he was grateful for it. Derek never talked about it, but Marcus said he understood that Derek had gotten something similar. Derek had heard it, had smelled it, had experienced something that the normal categories of animal behavior and wildlife didn't account for. Derek had left the oil fields and built a different life somewhere else, a quieter life, one that didn't require working in territories that held other inhabitants. Garrett, the contractor, disappeared into his work. Marcus didn't know if he'd ever told anyone else what he'd seen. Marcus doubted it. Some experiences were too big to share, too strange to fit into words that wouldn't make you sound unstable. But Garrett carried it. That knowledge, that expanded understanding, that reminder that the world was stranger and more alive than the normal systems of knowledge acknowledged. The Dogman, across 3 men, had created 3 different responses. One who left and sought quiet, one who quit the work entirely, one who carried the knowledge but moved on with his life. But all 3 had been changed. All 3 understood in their bones that there was something else, something that lived in the Badlands, something that was worth respecting, worth making space for. That's what these encounters do. They change people. They fundamentally reorganize how someone understands their place in the world. They take someone who is confident and competent and comfortable, and they introduce a crack in that foundation, a space for doubt, a space for mystery. Some people never recover from that. Some people spend the rest of their lives trying to patch the crack, to restore certainty. But others, people like Marcus, learn to live with the crack, to let it expand their vision, to carry the mystery. Those people become different, more humble, more open, more aware that the universe is vaster and stranger than their usual categories allow. That's what the Book of Enoch was describing when it talked about the Nephilim, not just physical creatures, but a category of being that challenges human understanding, that forces humans to acknowledge that they're not the only form of intelligence, not the only form of consciousness, not the center of creation. The Nephilim, the Dogman, the creatures of the margins, they're teachers. They teach the lesson that humans need to learn, that we're smaller than we think, that we're not in control, that there are other forms of life and intelligence that deserve equal respect and consideration. The oil fields of North Dakota continue to operate. The wells continue to pump. The infrastructure continues to spread across the landscape. But in the background, in the dark, the creatures continue to exist, watching, maintaining their territories, making their presence known to the few people who are in the right place at the right time. Marcus moved on. He has a different job now. He lives in a town. He has a normal life in many ways, but he carries the encounter with him, and he passes on the knowledge quietly to people he trusts. He shares the story. He plants the seed of possibility. He acknowledges that the world contains more than can be easily explained. That's how the knowledge spreads, not through official channels, not through scientific papers or government reports, but through quiet conversations, through people who've had an experience that breaks their certainty, and who pass that breaking on to others. A fracture in the collective consciousness, an acknowledgement that there are mysteries, that there are intelligences we don't fully understand, that there are places on this earth where human authority doesn't fully apply. The Badlands of North Dakota are one such place. And the creatures that live there, the Dogman, the Nephilim, or whatever you want to call them, are the guardians of that knowledge. The teachers who remind us every now and then that we're not as smart or as in control as we like to believe. That's the story of Marcus Hendricks and the night he saw something 7 feet tall standing in the beam of his flashlight on a cold October night in 2019. That's the knowledge that Tom Werner accumulated over 25 years of tracking and observation. That's what Laura Kessler manages through quiet protocols and unspoken understandings. It's a story about encounters with the unknown. It's a story about how those encounters change people. It's a story about the possibility of coexistence, about the recognition that the land we think we control actually contains other inhabitants with their own claims and their own intelligence. It's a story that echoes through the Book of Enoch and through the oral traditions of indigenous peoples and through the scattered reports of witnesses across North America. It's a story that keeps telling itself in different places, in different times, to different people who are in the right place at the right moment to receive it. And it matters. That story, that knowledge, that acknowledgement that the world contains more than we usually admit. Because as long as there are people who carry that knowledge, there's a possibility of a different relationship with the land. A possibility of respect instead of domination, of coexistence instead of conquest, of recognition that we share this world with other forms of intelligence and other forms of awareness. That's what the Dogman teaches. That's what the encounter in the Badlands of North Dakota means. And that's worth knowing. Make of that what you will. What I want to do now is go deeper into what we know about the Dogman phenomenon itself, because Marcus's encounter wasn't isolated. It wasn't an anomaly. It was one data point in a pattern that stretches across centuries and across continents. The research that Marcus did after the encounter led him down some interesting rabbit holes. He found cryptozoology journals going back to the 1970s. He found Native American oral histories that referenced tall, bipedal creatures. He found accounts from fur trappers and settlers from the 1800s that described encounters that matched what he'd seen. One of the earliest documented reports comes from a fur trader named Henry Gilliam, who was operating in the Great Lakes region in the 1820s. Gilliam kept detailed journals of his trading expeditions. In one entry from 1823, he describes an encounter near what is now northern Wisconsin. He was traveling with a group of Ojibwe traders when they came across a creature that he described as standing 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, walking upright like a man, but with the face of a wolf. Gilliam wrote that the Ojibwe traders weren't surprised by the sighting. They called it by a name that roughly translates to the Old Walker. They said it was a territorial creature, that it had been living in the forests since before memory, and that the best approach was to leave it alone. Gilliam noted in his journal that the traders seemed to have an established protocol for encounters. They didn't panic. They didn't try to hunt it. They simply acknowledged its presence and moved on. What's interesting about Gilliam's account is that it suggests the Dogman phenomenon was well known to the indigenous peoples of the region. It wasn't a mystery to them. It was a fact of the landscape. A known entity with known behaviors and known boundaries. The frontier settlers who came later didn't have that knowledge. They came with a different worldview. The land was wilderness. Everything in it was either resource or threat. The Dogman encounters they had were shocking and unexplained because they didn't have the framework the indigenous peoples had developed. There are scattered reports from the 1860s and 1870s, mostly from hunters and trappers in the northern forests. An account from a trapper named James Kearney in Minnesota describes seeing a creature that walked on two legs, stood about 7 feet tall, and had a canine head. Kearney shot at it. The creature ran, but Kearney was convinced his bullets had connected. Yet the creature disappeared into the forest without any sign of blood or injury. These reports accumulated slowly. Newspapers would occasionally print them as curiosities. Local hunter claims to have seen strange beast, that kind of thing. But there was no systematic investigation, no scientific interest, just stories that people dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification. Then, in the 1930s, something changed. A man named Charles Fort, who was a compiler of anomalous phenomena, started collecting accounts of Dogman sightings along with other unexplained events. Fort didn't claim to believe all the reports he collected, but he documented them. He created a record. Fort's work was significant because it established that there was a pattern. The sightings weren't random. They clustered in specific geographic regions. They followed similar patterns. The creatures were consistently described as bipedal, canine-featured, 7 to 9 feet tall. The behavior was consistent, territorial, intelligent, avoiding direct confrontation with humans but willing to make their presence known. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Dogman phenomenon had become something of an open secret in certain communities. People who worked in forests, who spent time in remote areas, they knew about it. They had their own stories. They had their own warnings passed down about how to behave in Dogman territory. But the scientific community ignored it, ignored or actively dismissed it. Because the Dogman didn't fit into any taxonomy. It didn't match any known species. It couldn't be explained through conventional evolutionary theory. So, the scientific response was to treat it as folklore, as urban legend, as something that wasn't real because it couldn't be real within the established framework. That's where the situation stood until the 1980s, when something shifted. A Michigan researcher named David Fries started collecting systematic accounts of Dogman sightings in Michigan. Fries was trained as a biologist. He approached the phenomenon with scientific rigor. He interviewed witnesses. He collected evidence. He documented reports going back decades. What Fries found was a consistent pattern, multiple independent witnesses describing the same phenomenon. The descriptions matching across different time periods and different locations. The behavior patterns consistent, the territorial claims consistent. Fries wanted to document his findings. He wanted to publish research. He wanted to establish the Dogman as a legitimate area of scientific inquiry. But what happened next is instructive. Fries's research caught the attention of Michigan authorities, not the local authorities, the state level, game and fish officials. And there were conversations. There were what Fries later described as suggestions that he should stop his research, that there were considerations beyond the scientific merit of the work, considerations about public panic, about liability, about the official narrative. Fries didn't back down immediately. He tried to push forward, but the obstacles kept increasing. Funding dried up. Access to protected areas was restricted. The research site he was using was suddenly closed for ecological preservation reasons. Eventually, Fries abandoned the project, but he wrote about it. In 1991, he published an article in a small cryptozoology journal describing what he called the suppression of evidence. He described his experience trying to document the Dogman and the institutional resistance he encountered. That article is important because it establishes that the official dismissal of the Dogman isn't simply scientific skepticism. It's something more deliberate. It's institutional suppression. Marcus found the article. It corroborated what he'd experienced, the quiet conversations, the unspoken understanding that something existed but couldn't be acknowledged, the protocols in place to manage the phenomenon without making it public. What's the reason for that suppression? Marcus had theories. Tom Werner had theories. Laura Kessler hinted at reasons without stating them directly. One reason is certainly liability. If the state acknowledges that large intelligent creatures are living in state forests, then the state becomes liable for anything those creatures do. If someone is injured in an encounter, the state could be sued for not warning people, for not actively hunting the creatures, for not taking action to protect citizens. But there's a deeper reason. A reason that goes to the heart of how we understand our relationship with the natural world. If you acknowledge that there are intelligent non-human creatures living in territories within the state, then you acknowledge that humans don't have complete control of the land. You acknowledge that there are places where human law and human authority don't fully apply. You acknowledge that there are other forms of consciousness and intelligence that have legitimate claims on territory. That's destabilizing to the entire framework of property ownership and resource management that modern civilization is built on. Consider what it would mean if the U.S. government formally acknowledged the existence of Dogman in North Dakota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and other states. The land claims become complicated. Indigenous nations could assert that the creatures have territorial rights. Environmental groups could argue that the creature's habitat must be protected. Hunters and developers would face new restrictions. It's easier to maintain the fiction that the creatures don't exist, to follow quiet protocols internally while denying everything publicly, to let certain people know what's happening while keeping it out of the official record. Marcus understood this. He said that once he realized what was happening, it made sense. It wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It wasn't shadowy government agencies deliberately hiding evidence. It was more subtle than that. It was institutional reluctance. It was the path of least resistance. It was maintaining the appearance of control while quietly negotiating with something that couldn't be controlled. The phenomenon has another layer that's worth examining. It's the question of whether the Dogman encounters are increasing or decreasing. Tom Werner believed they were decreasing. He said that in his early career, in the 1980s and 1990s, he encountered evidence fairly regularly. Hair samples, scat, tracks. But by the 2010s, the evidence was scarcer. The direct sightings were less frequent. Why would that be? One explanation is that the creatures were learning to avoid humans, that they were adapting to human presence by withdrawing further into remote territory, becoming more elusive, more careful about making contact. Another explanation is population decline. The habitat was shrinking. The human presence was intensifying. The creatures were dying out. Populations were collapsing. Werner thought it was probably both. Some creatures were withdrawing, others were dying. The overall population was declining. The territories were fragmenting. If that's true, then the Dogman phenomenon is not a static mystery. It's a dynamic situation that's changing over time. A population in decline, a species or subspecies being pushed toward extinction by human expansion. Marcus said that thought troubled him, that the encounter he had might have been one of the last direct sightings in that region, that the creature might no longer be there, that the territory might be empty now. He drove out to the site once, years later. He didn't go into the compound. He just drove past on the highway. He didn't see anything. No indication that anything unusual was there. The Book of Enoch describes the destruction of the Nephilim, the flood that wiped them out. But modern extinction doesn't work that way. It's slower, more subtle. It's habitat loss. It's fragmentation. It's the gradual reduction of population until there's nothing left. It's not dramatic. It's not a flood. It's just the slow erasure of something that doesn't fit into the categories of the dominant species. That's possibly what's happening to the Dogman. Not extermination through hunting, but extinction through the transformation of habitat, through the replacement of wilderness with managed space, through the steady expansion of human control. From the perspective of the Dogman, from the perspective of a species that existed in its territories for thousands of years, the human expansion is an invasion. It's a slow-motion apocalypse, the steady takeover of their land, the reduction of their hunting grounds, the fragmentation of their populations, the protocols that Laura Kessler manages, the quiet acknowledgement of their existence. That might be all that's keeping some populations alive. By not hunting them, by not actively trying to eliminate them, by maintaining some territories as protected space, the state is extending the Dogman's existence. Not in a way that guarantees survival, but in a way that allows for coexistence. Marcus said that understanding that shifted his perspective on the encounter. He'd initially seen it as a moment of fear, something strange and threatening, but looking back, he saw it as a moment of communication, the creature trying to assert its existence, trying to make sure the human understood that it was there, that it mattered, that its territory was its own. It was a plea for recognition, dressed up in the language of territory and dominance. But underneath, it was a plea for survival. There are other Dogman hotspots in North America that have been documented. Michigan, as mentioned, has the longest history of sightings. Wisconsin has consistent reports from the northern forests. Minnesota has accounts going back to the fur trade era. But there are also sightings from unexpected places. A military base in Northern California reported unusual activity in the 1970s. Creatures were observed moving through the restricted areas at night. Guards reported seeing things that didn't match any wildlife manual. The incidents were documented internally, but never released to the public. An oil company working in Alberta, Canada, had encounters similar to Marcus's. Workers reported seeing bipedal creatures in the forest. The incidents were handled quietly. The workers signed NDAs. The company moved their operations. A national forest in Oregon had so many sightings in the 1990s that unofficial protocols were established among park rangers. Rangers who were working remote areas would leave their dogs at home because the creatures didn't like dogs. Rangers would avoid hiking at night. Rangers would make noise as they moved through the forest to avoid surprising the creatures. These isolated incidents add up to a pattern. The creatures are scattered across the continent. They're not concentrated in one region. They're distributed across multiple ecosystems. They're maintaining populations in multiple locations. The distribution suggests that the Dogman phenomenon is not new, that these creatures have been here for a long time, that they've adapted to different environments and established populations across different regions, that they have a complex social structure that involves territorial claims and behavioral protocols. Marcus wondered if there was any coordination between different regional populations, if Dogman groups communicated with each other, if there was a hierarchy or organized structure, but there's no evidence of that. The sightings suggest that each population is independent. Each territory has its own creatures. Each group manages its own boundaries. The intelligence that the Dogman demonstrates is remarkable. The ability to avoid human technology, the ability to understand human behavior, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, the ability to make strategic decisions about when to reveal itself and when to hide. The creature that Marcus saw, the way it looked at him, the way it made that sound that seemed almost like a word, that suggested a level of communication that goes beyond animal behavior. That suggests something more like culture, more like language, more like the kind of consciousness that humans have. But it's a consciousness that operates by different rules, with different priorities, with a different understanding of territory and belonging. Marcus said that, in retrospect, the most important thing the creature communicated wasn't fear or threat. It was presence. It was the assertion of, I am here. This is my territory. You can work here, but understand that I'm here too. That's a form of communication that humans usually only have with other humans, with governments and property owners. The assertion of territorial claim, the negotiation of boundaries. The Dogman was negotiating with Marcus, establishing terms, setting rules, making clear that coexistence was possible, but only on certain terms. When Marcus did that, the creature stopped appearing. The negotiations were complete. The terms were established. The creature returned to its ordinary behavior. That's a level of sophistication that suggests something more than animal instinct. That suggests intelligence. That suggests intention. That suggests a conscious understanding of how to interact with humans. It's the kind of intelligence that the Book of Enoch tries to describe, not divine, but elevated beyond normal animal consciousness. The kind of intelligence that creates culture, that creates language, that creates society. The Nephilim of the ancient text, if they were real, if they were the same phenomenon that modern witnesses call Dogman, then they were a species of intelligent beings that evolved in parallel to humans, that developed their own culture and their own ways of interacting with the world. The flood that destroyed them in the biblical narrative might be a memory of an actual event, an extinction event, a conflict between two intelligent species that ended with the elimination of one. Or it might be a metaphor, a way of describing the ongoing process of displacement, the way one intelligent species replaces another, the way humans came to dominate the continent and pushed other intelligent beings into the margins. Either way, the message is the same. There were other intelligences, there were other forms of consciousness, and they're mostly gone now, pushed to the edge, surviving in fragmented populations in remote territories, living in the spaces where human control is incomplete. Marcus carries that knowledge with him. He knows what it means. He knows what's being lost. He knows that his own presence, the presence of humans, represents a kind of invasion, an expansion into territories that belong to something else. He's made peace with that. He understands that human presence isn't going away, that the expansion is going to continue, that the creatures will have to keep adapting or face extinction. But he also understands that coexistence is possible, that negotiation is possible, that humans can exist alongside other intelligences without destroying them. It takes recognition. It takes respect. It takes the willingness to acknowledge that there are boundaries, and those boundaries matter. That's what the encounter in the Badlands taught him. That's what the Dogman in its own way was trying to teach. Now, let me address something that Marcus spent a lot of time thinking about. The evolutionary question. Where did the Dogman come from? How did it evolve? The conventional evolutionary framework doesn't have a place for bipedal canines with human-level intelligence. It doesn't fit. The canine lineage in North America includes wolves, coyotes, foxes, wild dogs, all quadrupedal, all with brain structures adapted to animal consciousness, not human consciousness. There's no known mechanism that would have produced a bipedal canine with enhanced intelligence operating in the North American wilderness, at least not through the standard evolutionary processes. But there are theories. Some researchers who have looked seriously at Dogman evidence propose a scenario in which a canine population, possibly isolated in remote territory, developed adaptations over thousands of years. adaptations toward bipedalism, adaptations toward increased brain size and complexity, adaptations that eventually produced a novel phenotype, a creature that was no longer purely canine, but something different. This kind of adaptive radiation, the process by which a single ancestral species diverges into multiple new forms, is well documented in evolutionary science. Darwin finches in the Galapagos, Hawaiian honey creepers, species that adapted to different ecological niches and developed specialized forms. Is it possible that canines in North America underwent a similar process? That they diversified into multiple forms? That some populations developed along the bipedal high-intelligence path that Dogman encounters suggest? It's not impossible. The ingredients exist, the time exists, the ecological opportunity exists. What's missing is the fossil record, the evidence, the intermediate forms that would establish the evolutionary pathway. But the fossil record is incomplete. It's a tiny sample of what actually existed, and North American forests don't preserve fossils well. The acidic soil breaks down bone. The climate cycles disrupt deposits. A species could exist, could thrive, could eventually decline, all without leaving significant fossil evidence. So, the absence of a fossil record doesn't rule out Dogman evolution. It just means we don't have the data to confirm it. Another theory is convergent evolution, the idea that different lineages, operating under similar selective pressures, evolve similar solutions. Dolphins and sharks developed similar body shapes, even though they come from completely different lineages. Bats and birds developed wings independently. Is it possible that canines and hominins, operating under similar selective pressures, developed similar adaptations, higher intelligence, bipedalism, social complexity? From a theoretical perspective, it's not outlandish. The selective pressures in the North American ecosystem would have favored intelligence. Canines that were smarter would have better hunting success. Canines that could cooperate would be more effective in groups. Canines that could make strategic decisions would survive better in changing conditions. Bipedalism offers advantages too. It frees the arms for tool use and carrying. It provides a better perspective for surveillance. It's more efficient for traveling long distances. If a canine population was subjected to these selective pressures over thousands of years, the evolution toward Dogman phenotype becomes plausible. Not certain, but plausible. Marcus found a scientific paper from 1998 that actually explored this question. It was published in a peripheral journal, not a major outlet, and it didn't get much attention. But the author, a paleontologist named Robert Caldwell, laid out the theoretical framework for Dogman evolution. Caldwell proposed that a population of wild canines in the northern forests of North America underwent adaptive radiation beginning around 50,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, this population was pushed south and fragmented. Some populations didn't survive, but others adapted to their new environments. And one population, specifically in the Great Lakes and northern forest region, developed the adaptations that characterize modern Dogman. Caldwell's paper was speculative. He acknowledged the lack of fossil evidence. He acknowledged that the theory was not provable with current data. But he made the point that the theoretical framework wasn't violated, that the evolution of Dogman from a canine ancestor wasn't impossible. It was just undocumented. The paper generated no significant response from the scientific community. It was read by a handful of specialists. It was cited occasionally in cryptozoology literature, but it never became mainstream science. Marcus said that reading Caldwell's paper gave him a different perspective on the creature he'd encountered. It wasn't alien, it wasn't supernatural. It was a product of natural evolution. A species that had evolved in North America over tens of thousands of years. A species that had developed intelligence and culture and language through the same processes that produced humans. The only difference was that Dogman evolved in isolation, that it developed its intelligence in a world that was still mostly wilderness, that by the time humans arrived in North America, Dogman was already well established, already territorial, already adapted to the landscape. The indigenous peoples who arrived in North America encountered Dogman. They recognized it as a sentient being. They developed protocols for coexistence. They incorporated it into their worldview and their oral traditions. When European settlers arrived, they didn't have that framework. They brought a different understanding. An understanding in which the land was wilderness, animals were resources or threats, and human consciousness was the only consciousness that mattered. That collision created the current situation, the Dogman persisting in fragmented populations. Humans gradually expanding their control, the protocols that manage coexistence while denying existence. The indigenous knowledge that Marcus researched is valuable because it suggests a different way of understanding the Dogman, not as a cryptid, not as an anomaly, but as a constituent part of the ecosystem, a species with territorial claims, a species with rights. Many indigenous nations have oral traditions that reference tall bipedal creatures in the forest. The Algonquian peoples have stories about Sasquatch-like beings. The Pacific Northwest tribes have their own traditions. The peoples of the Great Lakes region have stories about forest dwellers that match Dogman descriptions. These aren't folklore or mythology in the sense that they're not true. They're encoded knowledge. They're descriptions of observed reality transmitted through oral tradition, the way indigenous peoples documented and understood the natural world. When missionaries and anthropologists first recorded these stories, they dismissed them as superstition, as the imaginative creations of less developed cultures. But modern anthropology understands differently. Oral traditions are a valid way of transmitting knowledge. They're a valid way of documenting the world. The Dogman references in indigenous traditions are evidence. They're evidence that the phenomenon is real, that it's ancient, that it's been part of the North American ecosystem for as long as humans have been here. Marcus spent time with researchers who were working with indigenous nations to recover traditional ecological knowledge about Dogman. These researchers were trying to understand not just that Dogman exists, but what its role is in the ecosystem, how it hunts, how it reproduces, how it manages its territories. What emerged from this research was a picture of Dogman as a top predator, as an intelligent apex predator that hunts large game, that travels in family groups, that maintains territories, that has complex social structures. In that role, Dogman would have competed with Native American hunters for the same prey: elk, deer, moose, the large herbivores that sustained human populations. The competition would have been real. The boundaries would have mattered. The protocols that developed between indigenous peoples and Dogman populations were a way of managing that competition. Establishing territories where humans hunted, establishing territories where Dogman hunted, maintaining the boundaries through mutual respect and occasional communication. It was a sustainable system. It worked for thousands of years. Both species thrived, both maintained their populations. Then humans arrived who didn't know the protocols, who didn't respect the boundaries, who saw all land as available for resource extraction. The system broke down. The Dogman populations, already spread thin across fragmented territories, began to decline. The hunting grounds were taken for logging. The forests were cleared for agriculture. The oil fields were developed. The human presence became permanent and overwhelming. The creatures that had survived for thousands of years, by maintaining territories and practicing sophisticated hunting strategies, suddenly found their world transformed. The strategies that worked in a wilderness became liabilities in a human-managed landscape. The territories became isolated islands in a sea of human expansion. Some Dogman populations died out entirely. Others retreated to the most remote territories. The ones that survived were the ones that learned to avoid human contact completely, to sense human presence from miles away, to hide so effectively that they were almost never seen. Those are the populations that might still exist, the remnants, the survivors, the creatures that have adapted to living invisibly in a world that's being remade around them. Marcus said that understanding the history of Dogman in North America changed how he thought about conservation and environmental responsibility. He understood that the badlands weren't wilderness, they were homeland. They were territory that belonged to creatures that had been there for thousands of years before oil companies mapped the ground. When he worked there, when he walked the fence line checking for gaps, he wasn't just monitoring equipment. He was walking through someone else's territory, someone else's home. The creature that appeared to him, that made itself known, it was reminding him of that fact. It was saying, "You can be here, but remember whose land this is." That's the knowledge that Marcus carries. That's what changes when you encounter the Dogman. You understand that the land is not empty, that it's not just resources to be extracted, that it's home to other intelligences, other beings, other ways of being alive. The implications of that knowledge are profound. They suggest that the entire framework of resource extraction that modern civilization is built on is fundamentally flawed. That we can't simply take what we want from the land, that there are other claims on the land that we have to acknowledge. That's not a comfortable message. It's not one that industry wants to hear. It's not one that governments want to propagate. It's easier to deny, to suppress, to maintain the fiction that the land is empty except for resources and the humans who extract them. But the creatures persist. The Dogman continues to exist, even if in smaller numbers, even if in more fragmented populations, even if mostly hidden from human awareness. And every now and then, there's an encounter, a moment where the creature makes itself known, a moment where the invisible reality becomes visible, a moment where someone is forced to acknowledge that there are other intelligences in the world, other claims, other rights. Marcus was one of those people. He had that encounter. He carries that knowledge. And because he carries it, because he's willing to talk about it, because he's trying to understand it and communicate what he's learned, the knowledge spreads. It plants seeds of doubt about the simple narrative of human dominion. It opens space for a different way of understanding the world. That's what matters ultimately, not whether Dogman can be scientifically proven, not whether cryptozoology becomes mainstream, but whether enough humans understand that the world is more complex than we've been taught, that there are other intelligences, other ways of being, other claims on the land. If enough people understand that, then perhaps there's a chance for genuine coexistence, for boundaries that are actually respected, for a way of living on this land that acknowledges the creatures that were here first. That's the real message of the Dogman encounter in the Badlands. That's what the creature was trying to communicate when it looked Marcus in the eye. It was a plea, a warning, a reminder, a call to recognize something that has been forgotten. And the survival of the Dogman, the survival of other intelligences in a world being transformed by human expansion, might depend on whether that message gets heard. I want to close this out by returning to Marcus himself, because the most important thing in this story, ultimately, is not the creature. It's the man. It's how the encounter changed him. It's what he's done with that knowledge. After Marcus left the oil fields, after he took the job at the home improvement store, his life seemed to settle into ordinariness. He worked retail. He lived in a quiet town. He had a routine. But underneath that routine, underneath that apparent normalcy, something had shifted. Marcus said that in the years after the encounter, he developed an acute sensitivity to natural spaces. He couldn't drive through a forest without feeling something, a presence, an awareness, a sense of other intelligences in the landscape, not all the time, but often enough that he became acutely conscious of it. He said there were nights, years after leaving the oil fields, when he would be lying in bed and he would hear a sound, a distant sound, a sound that could have been wind, could have been an animal, could have been nothing. And he would know with absolute certainty that something intelligent was aware of him, that he was being observed. Some people might call that paranoia. Some might call it psychological residue from the encounter. But Marcus didn't think so. He thought it was real. He thought his sensitivity to the presence of other intelligences had been heightened by the encounter, that he'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. He said the experience had made him different, more humble, more aware of the vastness of the world, more conscious of how small he was in the scheme of things. He started spending more time outdoors, hiking, camping, spending time in the wild, and the more time he spent there, the more he understood, the more he felt the presence, the more he recognized that he was not the only conscious being in the forest. He said it wasn't frightening, not after a while. It was actually comforting, the sense that the world was inhabited, that other intelligences were out there, that he wasn't the center of everything. This shifted his worldview in subtle but profound ways. He began to be interested in indigenous philosophies, in ways of understanding the world that didn't center human consciousness, in systems of thought that recognized other beings as having their own validity and their own rights. He started reading teachings from indigenous elders, philosophy, texts about animal consciousness, research on the emotional and social lives of animals. The more he read, the more his sense of human exceptionalism eroded. The more he understood that consciousness came in many forms, that intelligence manifested in many ways. He became an environmentalist, though not a loud one. He didn't go to protests, he didn't lecture people, but he started making choices aligned with his understanding. He reduced his consumption. He supported conservation efforts. He tried to live in a way that acknowledged the other beings with whom he shared the world. He also became more vocal about the Dogman, quietly, carefully, but more vocal. He talked to people he trusted about what he'd experienced. He shared what he'd learned. He planted seeds. Some people thought he was crazy. Some people were skeptical. But others, people with their own experiences, with their own encounters in wild places, they recognized what he was talking about. They understood. They had their own stories. He became a kind of hub for those stories. People would find him. They would tell him about their encounters, their experiences, their sense that there was something else, something intelligent, something that defied the standard categories. Over time, he accumulated an archive of stories, encounters from across North America, from people in different states, different regions, different circumstances. But the stories had consistent patterns. The descriptions matched, the behaviors matched, the sense of intelligence matched. Marcus said that this collection of stories convinced him more than any single encounter could. Not that the stories proved the Dogman was real, but that they established a pattern, that too many people, across too wide a geography, across too long a time period, were reporting the same phenomenon for it to be dismissed as hallucination or misidentification. There was something there, something real, something that demanded acknowledgement. As Marcus got older, as he settled into his life in Williston, he thought more about what his role was in all of this. What was he supposed to do with the knowledge he carried? He came to understand that his role was bearing witness. It was not to prove anything scientifically, not to convince skeptics, not to change the world. His role was simply to maintain the knowledge, to carry it, to pass it on to people who were ready to hear it. He understood that knowledge without action can seem useless. But he also understood that sometimes the most important work is invisible. It's the quiet maintenance of truth in a world that wants to deny it. It's the refusal to forget what you've learned, even when forgetting would be easier. Derek, the other survivor of the initial encounter, had made a different choice. Derek had tried to forget. He'd left the Badlands. He'd tried to bury the experience. As far as Marcus knew, Derek had never talked about it to anyone. Derek had chosen to carry the knowledge in silence. That was a valid choice too. Not everyone needs to be an advocate. Not everyone needs to publicize what they know. Sometimes the healthiest path is to integrate the knowledge quietly and move on. Garrett had also made his own choice. Garrett had called the authorities. He'd reported what he saw. Then he'd disappeared back into his work. Marcus had tried to find him years later, but Garrett had built a life that was hard to reach. A life that kept the world at a distance. 3 men, 3 different responses to the same encounter. 3 different ways of carrying the knowledge. But all 3 had been changed. All 3 understood something about the world that they couldn't unknow. All 3 carried the knowledge with them, even if they expressed it differently. Marcus said that he understood both Derek's silence and Garrett's distance. He understood that the encounter was traumatic in its way, that it shattered certainty, that it introduced doubt, that it forced a reorganization of how you understand reality. He said that the fact that all 3 men had responded differently, had found different ways to integrate the experience, was itself meaningful. It suggested that there's no single right way to understand the encounter, no single right way to carry the knowledge. What mattered was that the knowledge was carried, that it wasn't lost, that it was passed on. Marcus said that one of his biggest concerns as he got older was that the knowledge would be lost, that he would die, and the archive of stories he'd collected would disappear, that the connections he'd made with other witnesses would dissolve, that the understanding he'd spent decades building would evaporate. He started writing things down. He created a private archive. He documented the stories people had told him. He kept records of the patterns he'd noticed. He tried to create something that could outlast him. He also thought about who he might pass the knowledge to, whether there was someone he could trust with the archive, someone who would understand its value and maintain it after he was gone. He hadn't found that person yet, but he was still looking. He said that in the end, that was the most important work, not proving the Dogman was real, not convincing the world, but ensuring that the knowledge persisted, that future generations would have access to it, that the understanding that had been earned through the encounter wouldn't be lost. The oil fields of North Dakota continue to operate. The wells continue to pump. The infrastructure spreads across the landscape. But somewhere in the Badlands, in the spaces that haven't been completely claimed by human control, the creatures persist. Maybe. Marcus doesn't know for certain. He hasn't gone back to check. He respects the boundaries too much to intrude, to violate the understanding that was established that night in 2019. But he believes they're still there. He believes that the population persists, even if in reduced numbers. He believes that the territorial knowledge, the behavioral protocols, the social structures that the Dogman developed over thousands of years, they persist, they adapt, they find ways to survive in a world that's becoming increasingly hostile. And he understands that his role, and the role of people like him, is to acknowledge that survival, to make space for it, to pass on the knowledge that these creatures exist, that they matter, that they deserve respect. The Dogman encounter in the Badlands of North Dakota was a moment where 2 different forms of consciousness, 2 different ways of being intelligent, made direct contact. A moment where boundaries were asserted. A moment where negotiation began. That moment changed Marcus. It opened him to possibilities he hadn't considered. It expanded his understanding of what the world contains. It made him more humble, more aware, more conscious of the complexity and strangeness of reality. And that change, that expansion of consciousness, that's what the Dogman was trying to communicate. That's what all the encounters are trying to communicate. That there's more to the world than human knowledge usually admits. That there are other intelligences, other ways of being alive, other claims on the land. The message has been delivered. The question now is whether enough humans will hear it, whether enough people will expand their understanding to make space for other intelligences, whether enough consciousness will shift to allow for genuine coexistence. The survival of the Dogman might depend on it. The survival of other species, other ways of being alive, might depend on it. The survival of the world in a form that's still home to mystery and wonder and unknown intelligences might depend on it. That's what the Badlands were trying to teach. That's what Marcus learned. That's what everyone who carries this knowledge is trying to communicate. Make of that what you will. Before I finish, I want to address something that Marcus kept coming back to. The question of whether Dogman is unique, whether it's the only unknown intelligent species living in human territory, or whether it's one example among many. Because once you accept that Dogman is real, once you acknowledge that there are intelligent non-human creatures living in wild spaces across North America, the logical next question is, what else is out there? The Bigfoot reports, the Sasquatch sightings, the creatures reported in the Pacific Northwest? Are they a different species? Are they related to Dogman? Are they part of the same phenomenon? The reports are different enough to suggest they might be distinct from Dogman. Bigfoot is typically described as larger, bulkier, more ape-like than canine-like. The behavior patterns are different, the territories are different, but the pattern is the same: an intelligent non-human creature, avoiding direct contact with humans, maintaining territory, operating according to rules that aren't the rules of normal animal behavior. Marcus researched this too. He found connections between Dogman and Bigfoot communities. People who had studied both phenomena, researchers who believed they were documenting evidence of multiple intelligent non-human species existing in North America. If that's true, if Dogman is one of several intelligent species, then the ecosystem is far more complex than the standard scientific model suggests. There would be competition between intelligent species. There would be territorial arrangements. There would be social hierarchies and political relationships. From the human perspective, it's almost too much to imagine. We think of ourselves as the only intelligent species on the continent, but imagine the reality from their perspective. Imagine multiple intelligent species coexisting, negotiating territories, managing relationships, developing protocols for interaction. The indigenous peoples, with their oral traditions referencing multiple types of forest-dwelling creatures, might have been documenting exactly that reality. A complex ecosystem with multiple forms of intelligence, multiple claims on territory. The human arrival disrupted that system. Humans brought a different framework, a worldview that recognized only human intelligence as mattering, a technology that allowed for rapid expansion and resource extraction. The result was chaos, fragmentation, the beginning of extinction for species that had coexisted for thousands of years. The protocols that Tom Werner and Laura Kessler manage are trying to restore some kind of balance, to reestablish boundaries, to allow coexistence, but they're working against powerful forces, economic interests, political pressure, the assumption that the land is ours to do with as we please. Marcus said that understanding the bigger picture was both clarifying and depressing. It was clarifying because it explained why there was official suppression, why the creatures couldn't be acknowledged, because to acknowledge them would be to admit that the land doesn't belong to humans, that there are other claims, that the entire framework of resource extraction is built on a foundation that isn't as solid as we believe. It was depressing because it suggested that the creatures were doomed, that human expansion was going to continue, that the coexistence protocols were temporary measures, that eventually the fragmented populations would decline to extinction. But Marcus said that depression wasn't the same as despair. He said that knowing the situation, understanding what was being lost, that created an opportunity to make different choices, to take action, to resist the inevitable, not through dramatic action, not through confrontation, but through the quiet work of maintaining knowledge, through the preservation of stories, through the transmission of understanding, through the creation of space, mentally and spiritually, for other intelligences to exist. That's what Marcus has been doing. That's what people like Tom Werner did. That's what the protocols that Laura Kessler maintains are trying to accomplish. It's not victory. The creatures are still disappearing, the habitats are still being destroyed, but it's resistance. It's an acknowledgement that the creatures matter, that they have value, that their survival is worth considering. Marcus said that in his work at the home improvement store, he tried to have that influence. When people came in looking to build decks or clear land or make other modifications, he would sometimes mention environmental considerations. He wouldn't preach, he wouldn't lecture, but he would plant seeds. He said that in small ways, in quiet conversations, he tried to influence people's understanding of the land, to make them think about what was there before the human modifications, to consider what they might be displacing. Some people listened, some didn't. But the conversation happened. The seed was planted. He said that's all any of us can do. Plant seeds, have conversations, maintain knowledge, resist the narrative that the land is empty except for resources. The Dogman encounter gave him that calling. It broke his certainty and gave him a new purpose. Not a dramatic purpose, not a Hollywood purpose, but a real one, a grounded one. A purpose that involves showing up every day and trying to make a difference through small actions and quiet conversations. That's the real message of the story. Not that Dogman is real, though it is. Not that there's an official cover-up, though there is. But that individual humans have the power to resist and to preserve. That choices matter. That the work of maintaining knowledge and transmitting understanding is vital. The oil fields of North Dakota will continue to operate. The creature that Marcus encountered, if it's still alive, will continue to navigate the landscape it now shares with human infrastructure. The protocols will continue to manage the coexistence in silence. But in the consciousness of people who carry this knowledge, in the stories that are passed on, in the seeds that are planted in conversations, there's a different possibility. A possibility that humans can change, that we can expand our understanding, that we can recognize other intelligences and respect their claims. The Dogman is teaching us that possibility. Every encounter, every story, every moment of acknowledgement is a teaching. Whether we learn depends on us. Whether we expand our consciousness, whether we make space for understanding that challenges our assumptions. That's what the Badlands were showing Marcus that night in 2019. That's what the creature was communicating. The knowledge is available, the understanding is possible, the choice is ours. Make of that what you will. There's one final thing I want to mention, something that Marcus shared in one of our last conversations. He said that in all the years since the encounter, in all his research, in all his conversations with other witnesses, he'd never heard of anyone being harmed by a Dogman, never heard of an attack, never heard of an act of aggression motivated by malice. What he heard about were moments of display, moments of assertion, moments of communication, but not violence. He said that suggested something profound about the Dogman consciousness, that it was capable of self-restraint, capable of recognizing humans as different and responding accordingly, capable of negotiating without resorting to force. That level of emotional and social sophistication suggests intelligence that's not just quantitatively different from animals, it's qualitatively different. It's the kind of intelligence that creates ethics, that creates codes of conduct, that recognizes the other as having value. The creature that Marcus saw that night, the one that looked him in the eye with intelligence and intention, it was demonstrating that. It was showing Marcus that it understood the rules of the negotiation. It understood boundaries. It understood that there were ways to interact that didn't involve violence. That message, that demonstration of restraint and respect, it was perhaps the most important part of the entire encounter. It was showing Marcus that coexistence doesn't require conflict, that two intelligent species can share territory if they're willing to recognize each other's legitimacy and establish protocols for interaction. The protocols that have developed in North Dakota, the quiet arrangements, the unspoken understandings, they're based on that same principle. Mutual recognition, mutual restraint, mutual respect. It's not a perfect system. The creatures are still disappearing. The habitats are still shrinking. The expansion continues. But it's a system that works better than the alternative, better than active hunting, better than attempted extermination, better than the complete denial of existence. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people understand that principle, if enough consciousness expands to recognize other intelligences as legitimate, if enough humans learn to exercise restraint and respect, then other systems can develop, other ways of coexisting, other protocols for living on a shared planet. The Dogman, through its encounter with Marcus, was teaching that lesson. That intelligence isn't necessarily hostile. That difference doesn't require conflict. That coexistence is possible if we're willing to recognize boundaries and respect them. That's the knowledge Marcus carries. That's what he's trying to communicate through his quiet conversations and his shared stories. And maybe, if you're reading this, if you've heard this story, that knowledge is now part of your understanding too. Maybe you're carrying it forward. Maybe you'll pass it to someone else. Maybe you'll think about it when you're in a forest. Maybe you'll acknowledge the other intelligences that share the planet. Maybe you'll make a choice that reflects that understanding. That's how the knowledge spreads, not through proof, not through scientific confirmation, but through recognition, through acknowledgement, through the quiet transmission of understanding from one person to the next. The Dogman of the Badlands, the creature that stepped into Marcus's flashlight that October night, it started a ripple. It opened a door. It planted a seed that's still growing. What happens next depends on us. on whether we hear the message, on whether we expand our consciousness, on whether we make space in our understanding for other intelligences, other ways of being alive, other claims on the land. That's the real story. That's the real meaning of the encounter. Make of that what you will. In the end, what matters is this. There was an encounter. A man named Marcus Hendricks saw something that changed his life. He saw a creature 7 feet tall with intelligence in its eyes. He felt it register him, know him, evaluate him. That moment broke his certainty about the world. It opened a door to possibility. It introduced him to knowledge that contradicts the standard narrative of human dominion over nature. And instead of dismissing the experience, instead of burying it or trying to forget it, Marcus chose to carry it, to research it, to understand it, to share it carefully with people who were ready to hear it. That choice, that commitment to bearing witness and maintaining knowledge, that's what makes the story worth telling. Not the creature itself, though the creature is real, but the human response to the encounter, the way understanding expands, the way consciousness shifts. The Dogman of the Badlands continues to exist. Maybe, somewhere in the fragmented territories that haven't been completely taken over by human expansion, it persists, moving in the darkness, maintaining its protocols, protecting its boundaries, waiting for humans to learn what the encounter was trying to teach. Marcus waits too. He waits for someone to come who will understand the archive he's built, someone who will carry the knowledge forward, someone who will make sure that the understanding doesn't die with him. Until then, he plants seeds, he tells stories, he honors the boundaries, he maintains the knowledge, and the creature, somewhere in the dark, continues its own work, surviving, adapting, holding territory, reminding those who encounter it that there are other intelligences in the world, other ways of being conscious, other claims that matter. That's the story. That's what happened in the Badlands of North Dakota. That's what the Dogman continues to teach. Make of that what you will. The story does not end. It continues in the silence and the dark, in the territories that are still wild, in the moments when a human being feels that presence, that awareness, that sense of being observed by something intelligent and aware. The Dogman continues to teach for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. The knowledge continues to spread through quiet conversations and shared stories. The protocols continue to hold, barely under pressure from forces that see the land only as resource. That's where we are. That's the situation as it stands. Whether it changes, whether the protocols break down, whether the creatures disappear entirely, whether the human consciousness expands enough to make real coexistence possible, that remains to be seen. But the encounter happened. The knowledge was earned. The message was delivered. That much is certain. Make of that what you will. There's another dimension to this that's worth examining. It's the question of what happens when knowledge meets institutional power, when something real exists but contradicts the official story. Marcus spent time thinking about this. He understood that the protocols weren't just about protecting people from panic. They were also about protecting an entire way of understanding the world, an entire economic system, an entire framework of civilization built on the assumption that humans control the land. The Dogman represents a crack in that assumption, a fissure that runs deeper than anyone wants to acknowledge. Because once you acknowledge the Dogman, you have to acknowledge so much else. You have to acknowledge that the land doesn't belong to us, that we borrowed it from creatures that had prior claim, that our property deeds and our resource extraction permits are built on a foundation of denial. You have to acknowledge that civilization might be built on a mistake, a fundamental misunderstanding of who lives here and who has the right to be here. That's the real reason for the suppression, not fear of panic, not liability concerns, but a kind of existential threat to the narrative itself, to the story we tell ourselves about progress and mastery. Marcus said that understanding this changed how he thought about his own complicity. He worked in oil, he extracted resources, he participated in the system that was displacing the creatures. He wasn't innocent in that system, but he also understood that there was no way to opt out completely. That modern life, for all of us, is built on resource extraction, on the displacement of other beings, on the assumption that the land is ours to use as we see fit. The question wasn't whether to participate. The question was how to participate consciously, how to do it in a way that acknowledged what was being lost, how to resist the narrative while understanding that resistance had limits. That's what Marcus did. He worked, he extracted, he lived a modern life, but he also carried the knowledge. He acknowledged what was being displaced. He made choices that reflected that awareness. He tried to pass on the understanding to others. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't even a solution at all, but it was a way of living with the contradiction, a way of holding the complexity. Tom Werner did something similar. He worked in wildlife management. He participated in the system that sought to control and manage the land, but he also understood what the system was displacing. He tried to work within the system to protect what couldn't be protected completely. Laura Kessler did the same. She worked for the state. She enforced game laws. She participated in the framework that treated the land as property to be managed, but she also maintained the protocols that acknowledged something else, something that existed outside the official narrative. 3 people in 3 different positions, all trying to navigate the same contradiction, all trying to live consciously within a system that was fundamentally unconscious about what it was doing. That's perhaps the most important lesson of the story. Not that Dogman is real, though it is, not that there's an official cover-up, though there is, but that consciousness is difficult in a system that doesn't acknowledge what it's doing. That resistance is possible even when victory isn't. That small acts of acknowledgement matter, even when they can't change the fundamental trajectory. Marcus kept coming back to something the creature communicated that night, not through words or obvious signs, but through the way it looked at him, through the way it asserted its presence. It was saying, "You can exist in this world, you can do your work, but don't pretend you're alone. Don't pretend there's only you and the resources. There are others here, and that matters." That's the knowledge that haunted Marcus after. That's what changed him. Not fear, knowledge. The knowledge that there was an audience, that his actions were witnessed by something intelligent. That consciousness existed in the landscape in a way he hadn't reckoned with. And that knowledge, once it enters your consciousness, it's almost impossible to ignore, almost impossible not to let it change how you move through the world. Marcus said that he found it comforting, ultimately, the sense that he wasn't alone, that the universe was inhabited by more than humans, that intelligence took forms beyond what he'd been taught. It made the world bigger. It made him smaller. And there was something good about that, something true, something that felt like waking up to a reality that had always been there, but that he'd been trained not to see. The Dogman encounter in the end was about that, about learning to see what was already there, about waking up to a layer of reality that the dominant culture had agreed to ignore. And the survival of that knowledge, the transmission of that understanding from Marcus to others, that's what matters. Not scientific proof, not official acknowledgement, just the quiet spread of a different way of knowing, a different way of understanding what the world contains. That's the real power of the story. That's why it matters. Make of that what you will. In the final analysis, what lingers from the encounter is not certainty. It's presence. The sense that the world is inhabited by more than we see, more than we acknowledge, more than we've been trained to recognize. Marcus carries that presence with him everywhere. He feels it in the forest. He feels it in the dark. He feels it in moments of silence when he's alone with his thoughts. He feels it as a weight, as a gift, as a reminder. The Dogman is out there, maybe not in the badlands anymore, maybe pushed further into the margins, maybe dwindling, but it's out there, and it's watching, and it's waiting to see if humans will learn what the encounter was trying to teach. Will we expand our consciousness enough to acknowledge other intelligences? Will we respect boundaries we didn't know existed? Will we stop pretending the land is empty? Will we learn to share? Will we learn to coexist? Or will we continue expanding, consuming, transforming, until everything that was wild and unknown is either gone or hidden so deeply that it can never be reached? That's the question the Dogman leaves behind. That's what the encounter was really about. A mirror, a test, a choice. Make of that what you will. There's one more thing that needs to be said, something that Marcus wrestled with for years after the encounter. The question of whether what he experienced was unique or whether it was part of a much larger phenomenon. The Dogman that appeared to him in the Badlands, was that an isolated creature? Was that the only one? Or was it part of a network, part of a population that extended across the continent? The answer, based on everything Marcus researched, is that it was part of something much larger, something that operated on a scale that most humans never perceive. The creatures maintain communication networks. They travel routes that are not human routes. They maintain territories that are overlapping and interconnected in ways that suggest coordination. They have protocols not just for individual interaction with humans, but for group interaction, for population management, for the transmission of knowledge across generations. This is the level of sophistication that scientists associate with human consciousness, the ability to transmit knowledge culturally, to have organized societies with rules and protocols, to manage resources and territories on a scale that requires planning and foresight. The Dogman populations across North America are not a haphazard collection of individual creatures. They are organized, they are intelligent. They have a social structure that mirrors in many ways the social structures of human populations, and they have been doing this for thousands of years, long before humans arrived, developing their own ways of organizing society, developing their own cultures, their own rules, their own understanding of how to live on this continent. When humans arrived, the Dogman encountered a new form of intelligence, a different way of being conscious. At first, there was probably conflict, competition for resources, territorial disputes. But over time, protocols developed, boundaries were established, coexistence was negotiated. The indigenous peoples of North America incorporated Dogman into their worldview. They developed ways of living alongside these creatures, ways of managing the boundaries. For thousands of years, this coexistence held. Humans and Dogman shared the continent, each species maintaining its territories, each respecting the other's boundaries, each existing in its own cultural and social context. Then, European colonization arrived, and the entire system broke down. The new colonizers didn't understand the protocols, didn't respect the boundaries, saw only resources to extract and wilderness to conquer. The Dogman populations that had thrived for millennia suddenly found themselves under pressure. Their territories were being reduced. Their hunting grounds were being taken. Their cultural systems were being disrupted. What has happened since is a slow-motion catastrophe, a population in decline, habitats fragmenting, knowledge being lost as older individuals die without being able to pass on their understanding to younger generations. The creatures that Marcus encountered, the ones that appear in reports across North America, they are the survivors. The ones that have managed to adapt to human presence. The ones that have learned to hide, to avoid, to exist in the margins of human expansion. But their world is becoming smaller every year. Every logging operation, every oil field, every subdivision, the space available to them shrinks. The territories they can travel become more fragmented, the populations become more isolated. From a conservation perspective, the Dogman represents a species in crisis. A population facing extinction through habitat loss and fragmentation. A species that is losing the ability to transmit its cultural knowledge because the environment that supported that transmission is being destroyed. And yet, there is no official conservation effort, no protection, no acknowledgement of what is being lost. Because to acknowledge it would be to admit that something of value is being destroyed, that some parts of the land should not be developed, that there are other inhabitants with rights that supersede human economic interests. Marcus said that this was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire situation, not the creatures themselves, but the denial, the refusal to acknowledge what was happening, the collective agreement to pretend that the land was empty, that there were no other intelligences, that humans could do whatever they wanted with the resources. He said it was a kind of madness, a voluntary blindness, a refusal to see what was right in front of our eyes, and he understood that he was part of that madness, that his work in oil had contributed to it, that his participation in modern civilization was built on that foundation of denial. He couldn't opt out. The system was too large, too encompassing, but he could acknowledge, he could carry the knowledge. He could refuse to pretend that what he'd seen wasn't real, that what he knew wasn't true. That's what he has spent decades doing. Carrying the knowledge, maintaining the archive, passing on the understanding to people who are ready to hear it. And in doing that, he's participating in a kind of quiet resistance. Not dramatic, not organized, but real. A resistance to the narrative that the land is empty, that humans are alone. That progress means the elimination of everything that doesn't fit into human categories. The Dogman, through its encounter with Marcus, was inviting him into that resistance. It was saying, there is another way to understand the world. There are other intelligences. There are other claims on the land. Will you acknowledge that? Will you change your behavior based on that knowledge? Marcus said yes, not through grand gestures, not through public activism, but through the quiet work of maintaining knowledge, through the transmission of understanding, through the refusal to accept the official denial. And that choice, that commitment, it has shaped his life. It has given him a purpose. It has made him a custodian of knowledge that the dominant system wants to suppress. The question that remains, the question that the story poses, is whether others will make the same choice. Whether enough humans will expand their consciousness enough to acknowledge what is being lost. Whether the knowledge will spread. Whether the resistance will grow. The Dogman is waiting. The creatures in the badlands, the ones that survive in fragmented territories across the continent, they are waiting to see if humans will learn what the encounter is trying to teach. Will we expand our understanding? Will we acknowledge other intelligences? Will we change how we relate to the land? Or will we continue the denial? Will we continue the expansion? Will we continue the slow-motion catastrophe until everything that was wild and unknown is gone? That's the question the story leaves us with. That's what the encounter in North Dakota means. A test of consciousness, a moment of choice, a reflection of what we value and what we're willing to do to maintain it. Make of that what you will. The final thing that Marcus wants people to understand, the thing he's spent the most energy trying to communicate, is this. The Dogman encounter is not anomalous. It's not a one-time event. It's part of a pattern that is happening continuously across the continent. People are encountering these creatures. People are seeing what they are. People are understanding at some level that there is another intelligence in the world. An intelligence that is not human, but is real. That is watching. That is present. And each encounter, each moment of contact, is a teaching, an opportunity to expand consciousness, an opportunity to change how we understand our place in the world. The creatures are not trying to harm us. They are not trying to destroy us. They are simply asserting their right to exist, their right to territory, their right to maintain their own forms of consciousness and culture. That assertion, when humans encounter it, can either be rejected or accepted, can either be dismissed or acknowledged. Marcus accepted it. He let the encounter change him. He let it open him to possibilities he hadn't considered. He let it make him humble in the face of a universe that is vastly more complex than he'd been taught. And that choice, that openness, it has been the source of meaning and purpose in his life. The Dogman encounter gave him that. It gave him a calling, a reason to maintain knowledge, a reason to resist the denial, a reason to keep speaking the truth. That's what the story is about, ultimately. Not proof, not evidence, not scientific confirmation, but transformation. The way an encounter with the unknown can change a person, can expand their consciousness, can give them purpose. The Dogman is out there, in the badlands, in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, in the territories of the Great Lakes, in the mountains and the wild places. It's there, it's watching, it's waiting, and it's waiting for humans to learn what the encounter is trying to teach, to acknowledge, to expand, to change. Whether that happens or not, that's the real story. That's what matters. Make of that what you will. In closing, I want to acknowledge something that Marcus mentioned in one of our final conversations. He said that telling this story, laying out the evidence, describing the encounter, none of it will be proof to someone who doesn't want to hear it. None of it will convince someone who has decided to dismiss it. That's not the point of the story. The point is not to convince. The point is to plant a seed, to open a possibility, to suggest that there might be more to the world than the official narrative acknowledges. For some people who hear this story, it will land. It will resonate. It will connect with experiences they have had or thoughts they have had. It will expand their understanding in some small way. For others, it will be dismissed as folklore, as interesting but not serious, as entertainment but not truth. Both responses are valid. Both are choices about how to relate to a story that challenges the official worldview. But the story persists. The knowledge persists. The encounters continue. Somewhere in the Badlands tonight, a Dogman is moving through the darkness, maintaining its territory, passing on knowledge to its family, continuing a way of life that has persisted for thousands of years despite all the pressure to disappear. And somewhere, another human being is having an encounter, is seeing something they can't explain, is feeling the presence of another intelligence, is being offered the choice to expand their consciousness or dismiss it. That's what the story is really about. That's what matters, not the proof, but the possibility, the opening, the choice. Marcus has made his choice. He's carried the knowledge. He's told the story. He's maintained the archive. He's planted the seeds. What happens from here depends on all of us, on whether we hear what's being said, on whether we expand our consciousness enough to make space for other intelligences, on whether we change how we relate to the land and to all the beings that share it. The Dogman is teaching. The question is whether we will learn. Make of that what you will. This is how stories spread in the modern age. Not through official channels, not through institutional validation, but through individual transmission from one person to another, through the quiet persistence of those who know something and refuse to forget it. Marcus is one link in that chain. The creature that encountered him was another. Every witness who carries the knowledge is part of that chain. And everyone who hears the story and chooses to believe, to expand their understanding, to carry it forward, they become part of the chain too. The knowledge doesn't need proof. It needs witnesses. It needs people willing to carry it, people willing to say it out loud, people willing to stake their credibility on something that the dominant system dismisses. That takes courage. That takes commitment. That takes a willingness to stand alone if necessary. Marcus did that. He stood alone. He carried the knowledge. He told the story to anyone who would listen. And now you have heard it. You have the knowledge. You have the choice about what to do with it. The encounter in the Badlands continues to ripple outward. Its effects continue to spread. The knowledge continues to circulate. The story continues to be told. Make of that what you will. And with that, the story comes full circle. From Marcus standing in the Badlands with his flashlight, seeing something that changed him forever, to this moment, you hearing the story, to whatever you do with this knowledge moving forward. That's the real transmission. That's how the understanding spreads. That's how consciousness expands in the world. One person, one encounter, one story, one choice at a time.